working ages of 15 to 64. I'm going to use that as a symbol, a visual symbol of Africa today. Here's Korea in 2000. In the early 60s, a steep fertility decline set in, and by 2000, the year 2000, fertility in Korea had fallen to about 1.5 births per woman, well under replacement. And you see that swollen mid part of the pyramid, which accounts for population momentum. It also is very favorable for economic development because you have an exceptionally high ratio of potential workers to dependent young and dependent old. Between 1960 and 2000, the number of workers per dependents in Korea doubled. But that wonderful age structure doesn't last. And here's Korea as it will be in 2040. That swollen mid part of the pyramid has now aged, and even though these projections built into them an increase in fertility between 2000 and 2040, nevertheless, the population has aged vastly. The ratio of workers to dependents has gone back more or less to what it was in 1960. So that wonderful era where there were lots of workers, a few children, a few old people, has been replaced by a situation where 20 to 30% of the population are aged 65 plus. This is the destination of humanity. There is no escape. And I'm going to use that figure of Korea as the symbol for Europe. You might notice that funny projection out here. All those women aged 80 plus. This is because Korean women refuse to die, whereas men are killing themselves off in Korea with cigarettes and alcohol. Europe won't have such a huge surplus of women as Korea. So let's turn first to Europe. Broadly, I see the world as three different types of demographic scenario. The advanced industrial economies of the Far East and Europe, faced with population aging and possible population decline. A middle group symbolized by Korea in the year 2000, where age structure is favorable for development because there are lots of workers, and that broadly represents Asia and Latin America. And the third group of countries, predominantly in Africa, where the pyramid is still broad-based and population growth is still rapid. Well, these are pretty familiar to you. It just shows the proportion of people aged over 65 and aged over 80 is bound to increase in Europe over the next 45 years. And looking at another way round, the number of workers, conventionally defined as 15 to 64, to the ratio of those to old people 65 plus, is going to diminish. From in Europe, the left-hand side, from 8 in 1950, 8 workers per old folk, down to 2. Now, I happen to be an old folk, and I do rather resent this convention that the working population is defined as 15 to 64, because in my experience, virtually nobody starts work at 15. All the children of my friends don't start work until they're about 25 because they have gap years between school and university, and then when they've graduated, they drift around the world. So this 15 to 64 is quite a misleading convention. Now, I mentioned that fertility in Europe is roughly 1.5 births per woman, ranging from 2 in France down to a little over 1 in Russia and the Mediterranean countries. If that doesn't change, this is what population structure will look like in the long term. An inverted pyramid, with each age group as you go down from older to younger, smaller and smaller. This is a population that's going to halve every 65 years, if sustained without in-migration. It's a prospect that delights environmentalists. There are strong pressure groups in England calling for a halving of population. But it absolutely horrifies economists and politicians. Because an ever-decreasing labour force has to support, a bit like Hercules, this giant number of old people. And it alarms politicians because if Europe does halve in size every 65 years or so, Europe's role in world affairs is almost bound to diminish. This, incidentally, is what a population structure with a total fertility rate of 2 looks like. A much more beautiful beast, you might say, with cohort sizes pretty even across the age groups. Can migration come to the rescue? Well, the third row of figures, these figures on the right are all in millions. In the late 90s, it is thought that Europe had in-migration of about 1 million a year, a little under 1 million a year. If you wanted to keep the population from declining, you would have to double that. If you wanted the age group 15 to 64 constant in size, you'd have to treble the number of migrants. If you wanted to keep the ratio of 15 of workers, 15 to 64, that ratio to old folk at above 3 workers per retired person, you'd have to quadruple the number of in-migrants per year to 4.25 billion. And if you wanted to keep the ratio of workers to people 65 or more, you'd have to raise in-migration to 25 million. Now, it's pretty clear to me from those figures that while migration may have a positive role to play in Europe's development, it can never be on the scale to make a serious impact on population aging. So Europe has to face an aging and greying population. It has to adapt to it, and I think we're rich enough and clever enough to do that. We need to reform pension systems. We need to increase labour force participation amongst the 15 to 64-year-olds, which is only typically about 60% in Europe as a whole. And above all, we need to raise the retirement age. Many governments are doing that. Certainly the UK is doing it. I'm not sure about the Netherlands. It's deeply unpopular, but I point out that 65-year-olds today are much fitter than 65-year-olds were 50 years ago. But there are some nasty inequities. Why should a manual labourer who started work at 16